So I decided to start with this slide because in February 2014, the Philippine government finally recovered around 30 million from multi-million dollar accounts that the late dictator Ferdinand Marcos stashed in Swiss banks. What allowed the government to gain control over the money were forfeiture cases which proved that amounts contained in the accounts exceeded total legal income of the Marcoses while they were in office. And the evidence, one of the primary evidences that was used to prove the government's case included the financial disclosure statements filed by the Marcoses while in office. So it might seem like good news except for this. It took the government almost 3 decades to recover the money. Neither Marcos nor his wife Imelda were ever convicted of any wrongdoing. So you might say, as the Anti-Graft and Corrupt Practices Act, the law that required the Marcoses to file those disclosure statements, date back to the 1960s. In 1989, years after the Marcoses were booted out of office, the Philippine Congress enacted a new law which allowed the public to photocopy assets and liabilities statements of government officials. So this is significant because out of 101 countries in one World Bank studies, out of 101 countries, only 31 require disclosures to be made public, to be made available to the public. So this is, in a way, the Philippines might seem to be not a laggard when it comes to laws for access to information. The people's right to information on matters of public concern has been constitutionally recognized in the Philippines since 1973. And in 1986, after the EDSA uprising, this right was further expanded in the 1986 Constitution to include access to research data used as basis for policy development. And while there is no enabling law yet, in the Philippines, the Supreme Court has already ruled a number of times that in more than one occasion that the constitutional mandate is enforceable. In fact, the same code of ethics that I mentioned earlier also mandates that, or also makes it the obligation of public officials to make documents accessible to the public. The implementing rules of this law lay down the rules for a system for promoting transparency of transactions and access to government information. It also sets the limits of access. More recently, the Aquino administration, as we know, has been making strides in promoting transparency in government by proactively disclosing budget and project documents through these portals. So it's no small wonder then, while the Senate has approved the bill on third reading, members of the House of Representatives continue to drag their heels on this matter. Because if those laws are already active, we ask, why then is an access to information law still necessary? So to answer this question, Rappler, with the support of the Friedrich Naumann Foundation, analyzed freedom of information laws in other parts of the world. And then we looked at the common features of the laws we studied. So the idea is to find out why this is still urgent, because obviously, like, the urgency thing is not recognized. We wanted to look at FOI from fresh lenses, and hopefully we want to actually give, hopefully this will be used by members of Congress when the debates start again. So, and then, so this is what we did. This is how we did it. And then we answered these questions. How does making key information publicly available affect government operations and services in countries we studied? What information is made available? What are the key features of the laws in those countries? And what are the minimum requirements for disclosure? So these are the limitations of the study. It's a purely online research, so it does not pretend to be a very exhaustive study. And these are among the key sources we also used. So what are the common features of the laws we studied? What we saw is this: an overall policy making information available. The other feature is limits to access. And then the laws typically prescribe processes by which information may be accessed, cost of access, and then processes of appealing request refusals. In more recent cases, the more recently enacted laws, what we noticed are there are penalty clauses, and then there are oversight bodies. How does this apply to the Philippines? So in the Philippines, what we noticed, and an advocate here, Nepo Malaluan, actually mentioned this on a story on Rappler, there's an even or selective release of information. So there is access, but not everything is accessible. So while the Code of Ethics makes it the obligation of public officials to make public documents available, journalists have found time and again that requests may be refused without any clear grounds. Selective release is true even for requests of asset disclosure statements, even though the law already requires that they be available for photocopying within 10 days, so even the days are specified after which they are received. So 3 years after the impeachment trial, the House that prosecuted Chief Justice Renato Corona has yet to create rules releasing the disclosure statements of its members. The House just discloses summaries. Rappler has been requesting for those statements every year since we started, and each time we were denied. This is in stark contrast with the co-equal branch of Congress, the Senate, which releases full copies of the statements to media. So that's where the uneven, unequal, selective release comes in. Similarly, the General Procurement Reform Act, which mandates transparency in the procurement processes and equal access to information for bidders, stops short of requiring access to actual contracts. And we have seen this as journalists because we have been requesting for contracts. And in many cases, we have to resort to getting copies from insiders. Short of going to court, which can be expensive and time-consuming, there is no clear process for appealing requests for information. In contrast, in countries with FOI laws, this one is from a website of the Information Commissioner's Office in UK. The bias is for access, and the bias is for making it as easy as possible for the public to access information. All you need to do is send the postal address or the email address. You can even ask verbally. And this is very important. You don't even have to explain why you want the information. In many cases, when we requested for information in government offices, we were asked to justify. This is very different. Now, those who are lukewarm to the proposed FOI claim that this would allow sensitive government information to fall in the hands of bad social elements. But we have seen, Senator Poe has already pointed out, this is also true of many countries. FOI laws typically have exceptions lists. And these are possible grounds for refusal in most of the laws we studied. And these are the typical exceptions. One of them is personal privacy, and another typical exception is security or national defense or public safety. These are the typical formats that are made available. In some cases, even emails and letters are available. So think of the implications of that for cases when congressmen or senators or even other public servants ask for releases of funds. Normally, this information we are not able to access. These are other Now, this is very interesting to us because while the duty to record is already reflected, the duty to preserve information is reflected in some laws. Like, for instance, in the Philippines, duty to record from time to time or publish congressional proceedings, including how members of Congress voted, has been constitutionally mandated since 1935. But in truth, much of congressional proceedings remain inaccessible or not even preserved. So this is particularly true for much of the budget proceedings, as our friends in the legislative branch would probably attest. So, and while the administration has already undertaken measures to make budget information more transparent, what we have seen from the PDAF and then the DAP controversies is that much of government in financial transactions are still hidden from the public eye. Oversight and penalties. This is typical of FOI laws we studied and missing in the local scene. So there are no penalties for public officials who whimsically refuse access to requests. And these are the typical offenses that we have seen in, punishable offenses that we have seen in the countries we studied. So the UK punishes anyone who deliberately destroys or alters or blocks access and conceals info. Penalty, maximum of 5,000 British pounds. Canada, maximum of 5,000 to 10,000. And one of the punishable offenses is obstructing the Information Commissioner's duties. In Indonesia, failing to provide the public with information or publish information to be published in the process, and in the process causing harm, so failing to provide information and in the process causing harm can be punishable with as much as 1 year imprisonment. But perhaps the biggest argument that we see for enacting an FOI law in the country is new technology. So the biggest argument is the need to institutionalize access to government data and information online in open machine-readable formats. Now, while the government has already been making strides in this, what we have seen is that much of the information is not available. So in fact, we reviewed the open data portal, and we have seen that to a large extent, only summaries are provided. The data is not as granular as we would like it to be. And it's not consciously updated. It's not updated in a timely fashion. So clearly, there's still a little push is still necessary for data guardians in government to share their data. In fact, when we were trying to get data on DRR, hazard data related to disasters, we did encounter difficulties getting the data. Budget Undersecretary, in an earlier forum of Rappler, Budget Secretary Richard Moya pointed this out. There are roughly 7,000 auditors in COA and less than 100 million Filipinos. So if a third of them have broadband access and we make data available, we make auditing everybody's business. So we'll have about 300,000 auditors. In contrast, what usually happens is audit is selective. So we were able to do this for Corona, but not for a lot of officials because we don't have access. We were able to do this for the budget, but not for the budget releases because it's not yet available. And we would like to see this. Are resources equally distributed? We don't know because the data is not the data available is not enough. This is what we found in countries with FOIs. So typically, laws have not been static. So for those who have been dragging their heels, actually, a lot of the countries that have enacted FOI laws have amended their laws so many times. And typically, what the amendments are a result of the balancing act between access and then government security, well, personal privacy. So that's typical of all the countries we studied. So this is Sweden. Sweden was the first country to enact an FOI law 200 years ago. It has amended its law several times, and it has also passed the secrecy ordinance some time ago. But it went back to this, balancing privacy access with privacy. UK, one of the countries we studied, enacted its first FOI law in 2000. In 1990, before it enacted its FOI law, what it did is it also enacted data protection. And then in 2004, it enacted an Environmental Information Regulations Act. This is something we noticed of European countries, that typically environmental data is specified as among the accessible data. I'll skip this. 95 countries have already approved FOI laws as of 2013, and the right to access official information is protected in 59 countries. This is very bothering. Rwanda, Guyana, Sierra Leone, and Spain enacted a law before us. Now, this is right to information. There's this website, right to information, and the top 4 countries with the strongest laws are these countries: Serbia, India, Slovenia. And typically, these are the countries that have gone through turmoil. These are countries who have emerging democracies, so they need stronger laws. Impact of FOI. In the US, civil rights groups have invoked FOI to gain access to data on wrongly convicted prisoners. So FOI has not just been invoked in corruption cases. We have seen that it has been invoked in human rights violations, it has been invoked in environmental issues, and so on. In Mexico, the FOI law has been successfully invoked a number of times to open records to human rights abuse. India got 2 million requests for information after a 25-year struggle to have an access to information law. As Congress continues to dilly-dally on the Philippines' first FOI, it might be worth noting that the United States, we say that we have that security is an issue. Secrecy of government transactions is an issue. But the U.S. in 2007, years after the tragedy that traumatized, years after the 9/11 tragedy traumatized the country, the U.S. Congress passed the Open Government Act of 2007. So clearly, it's possible to balance concerns over security with the need for transparency. At the end of the day, it's really a question of whether we want to wait another 3 decades to recover money lost through corruption, as in the case of the Marcos wealth, or if we want to prevent or at least reduce corruption and abuse of office by making the processes more transparent now.